From among the classical 7 planets visible to the naked eye, Saturn, the first in the Chaldean order, that dim and slow-moving planet riding the outermost sphere, will be our topic. We'll be unpacking some of the ways this planet is represented in the Latin Picatrix, a text which had a great impact in the latter half of the 15th century on humanist conceptions of astrological bodies and their many associations with the things of this world. Composing between 954 and 959, the author of the Arabic original, Hayat al-Hakim, The Goal of the Sage, Abu el-Qasim Maslama al-Qurtubi, who died in 964, claims to have relied on 224 books of ancient sages. It was translated into Castilian as Picatrix, and then on into Latin as Picatrix shortly thereafter. This 4-book compendium was read with varying degrees of approval and disapproval by such giants in the history of Western esotericism as Marsilio Ficino, Johannan Alamano, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, and Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa. Ultimately, the Picatrix played a significant role in reinforcing and fleshing out these Renaissance philosophers' respective thoughts about astral magic and the highly correlative nature of the cosmos. Their inheritance was a world centered not on the interaction of physical particles in an endless expanse of space, but on the hidden sympathies between the human soul and all the things of this world hanging down from God in a great hierarchy of being, a kind of enclosed system held together through a complex network of imperceptible stellar rays. For many of the magically minded, from al-Qurtubi to Ficino, to plumb the inner workings of these sympathies, along what Arthur O. Lovejoy later dubbed the Great Chain of Being, was to attain the very height of philosophy itself, since it was by this scientia, or this knowledge alone, that they believed that man could perfect himself and ultimately be reunified with God. Within this paradigm, every planet above the firmament represented a kind of network hub amid this web of sympathies, and as such, knowledge of planets served as pathways to self-actualization. This discussion, therefore, first provides an overview of ancient and medieval perceptions regarding Saturn in order to elucidate some of the general historical changes and the continuities which colored that planet's gradual transformation from a god into an object of astral magical ritual. Following this, the discussion contrasts these perceptions with the image of Saturn and his correspondences as they appear in Picatrix. Thereafter, special attention is given to the conceptualization of Saturn in the thought of Marsilio Ficino, highlighting the ways in which he appropriated and reformulated ideas in a careful process of sanitizing idolatrous and abominable elements from the books that he studied. We'll see that all this was done within the context of Ficino's magico-medical project, which was produced at the summit of a long career in studying the philosophy of body-soul management. His therapeutically oriented project, through the medium of print, would spread quickly throughout the Latin West during the 16th century, carrying his complex conceptions of Saturn and all the other celestial bodies further than ever before, only to lose its popularity throughout the period of the scientific revolution. Leading Ficino scholar Michael J. B. Allen has recently written about this subject in his essay Marsilio Ficino on Saturn, the Plotinian Mine, and the Monster of Averroes, but his article deals more so with how Ficino adopted the identification of Saturn with the second hypostasis, or mind, from Plotinus's metaphysics, and as such leaves plenty of room for a brief history of that planet's magico-medical correspondences as they pertain to Ficinian cosmology in De Vita. Although I could have used any one of the 7 planets as the object of a general case study on the 7 planets in Picatrix, I settled on Saturn in particular because he is the planet most relevant to the scholar. This is an association clearly expressed in the Picatrix itself, but one can find it especially emphasized and elaborated in Ficino's writings, which helped further sublimate the almost purely negative perceptions of Saturn and melancholy from the medieval European perspective rooted in Galenic humoral theory and Ptolemaic astronomy into a more ambivalent force, something potentially more productive and less fatalistic. To use the words of Eric Zaffran, who did his own study on the changing role of Saturn in the Renaissance with an eye toward his link to Judaism, Saturn had long been, quote, the representative of the lowest rungs of medieval society. Individuals born under his influence were held in scant regard until, with the last quarter of the 15th century, the Neoplatonic elevation of the deity somewhat reformed their character. End quote. This Neoplatonic elevation, Zaffran mentions, is doubtless a stand-in for the medico-philosophical and astromagical work done by Ficino. Ficino himself claimed that his work in the 3rd book of De Vita Libri 3, De Vita Coelitus Comparanda, on attaining life from the heavens, began as a reaction and commentary to Plotinus. Nevertheless, the kind of work he produced should strike readers less as a work of Neoplatonic philosophical commentary, and more so as a mirror for princes in the style of the Secretum Secretorum, the Sir al-Asrar, a kind of work which compiled together a broad range of advice for rulers in matters ranging from statecraft and ethics to medicine, astrology, and even the optimal use of talismanic magic. In addition to this pseudo-Aristotelian medieval classic, Ficino was deeply indebted to his readings of astrological works like De Radiis of Al-Kindi, the Great Introduction of the Persian Abu Mashar, and the book known as Picatrix, which, unbeknownst to him, was written by Maslama al-Qurtubi. Whereas Zaffran focused his attention on the connection between the negative elements of Saturn and anti-Semitic portrayals of Jews, this paper will attempt to trace out some of the steps in that so-called Neoplatonic elevation of Saturn, and the sources by which this process was made possible. What we'll find is that the most important of Ficino's sources could only really be said to be Neoplatonic in part, being rather more emphatically informed by the influence of pseudo-Aristotelian, Aristotelian, and Hermetic sources, whose opinions of Saturn were noticeably more ambivalent. During the Renaissance, astrological speculation was no mere tabloid trifle or isolated discipline. Powerful families like the Este in Ferrara commissioned complex astrological murals replete with decanic images drawn from Picatrix and personifications of the planets to decorate their palaces. In Florence, the Signoria hired professional astrologers to elect the most fortunate days and hours for the condottieri to be awarded their baton of command. Moreover, physicians of princes throughout Italy had long relied on astrological data to make medical prognostications and offer cures. To use the words of Eugenio Garin, the Middle Ages had been greatly concerned with astrology and religion, astrology and politics, astrology and propaganda, but also astrology and medicine, and astrology and science, a philosophy of history, a conception of reality, a fatalistic naturalism, and an astral cult. Astrology was all this and more. What came to a head in the Renaissance, as Guérin emphasized, was the sheer volume of all these different astrological ideas, with all their internal contrasts and contradictions building up. All this was happening precisely while those practitioners of the Studia Humanitatis began re-envisioning the character of the planets with imagery of pagan deities drawn up from the classics. During this period, Saturn, in his many guises difficult to reconcile, was certainly one such figure fraught with internal contrasts and contradictions. Part 1. Saturnus Redivivus. In order to understand Saturn as he was understood in the 15th century, through the eyes of the Arabs or the Platonists read by Ficino, we need to soften our modern materialism, which sees that planet as a massive ringed object hurtling through space around the Sun, taking 29.5 years to complete a single orbit. Instead, we need to see Saturn as a star, a luminous celestial soul, endowed with a will of his own, surrounded by invisible spirits, and put in his place by God as part of the mechanism which weaves the fabric of the microcosm or lesser world, connecting all elements, minerals, vegetables, animals, and of course the humors which constitute human beings. In his own words, Ficino explained, "For since the Chaldeans, Egyptians, and Platonists believe the celestials are not empty bodies, but bodies divinely animated and ruled, moreover, by divine intelligences, no wonder they believe that as many good things as possible come forth from thence for men, goods pertaining not only to our body and spirit, but also overflowing somewhat into our soul, and not into our soul from their bodies, but from their souls. And they believe too that the same sort of things, and more of them, flow out from those intelligences which are above the heavens." End quote. Given that from within this paradigm, Saturn can only be understood through an analysis of his relations, from his transfer of goods, I here wish to illustrate some of the correspondences that were traced out between this planet and the things of this world leading up to Ficino's considerations on traditional astrology and medicine. Perhaps the most fundamental of these correspondences concern Saturn's relationship to the concept of time. The reason Saturn is associated with time in his imagery is twofold. Because as the outermost planet of the Chaldean order, his orbit encapsulates all other orbits. He was thus believed to have been the first planet set in motion, initiating time by subsequently setting every other planet in motion in the spheres below. And two, because of his form as a Latin god, he was thought once upon a time to have ruled over a golden age, an age which is fundamentally different from that of the observers, an idea which creates a sense of temporalization in the face of historical discontinuity over long spans of time. On account of his mythological portfolio, his physical distance from the Earth, and the length of time it takes for him to transit across the firmament, Saturn most closely reflected the Platonic concept that time is the moving image of eternity. Plato's Timaeus first presented the idea that the demiurge had created an unmoving image of eternity called ion. Once set in motion, however, the moving image of eternity became known as Chronos. Over centuries, this Greek figure for time itself was syncretized with Saturnus, the Latin god of a prelapsarian agricultural golden age, who ruled prior to the reign of Zeus Jupiter. Cicero, incidentally a translator of Plato's Timaeus, elaborated on this with a Stoic reading of the myth in De Natura Deorum 25, a text which was readily available to readers in the medieval Latin West. Both Cicero and Plutarch explained that the Greek name Chronos is synonymous with the word chronos, a span of time in Greek. And this was on account of the fact that the god sustains the cycle of the seasons and the periodization of time. Meanwhile, Cicero also told us that the name Saturnus denotes how saturated he was from devouring his children, a folk etymology based on the Latin saturaretur annis, with the implication that time devours all. Cicero adds that Saturn was bound by Jove in order that time's courses might not be unlimited, and that Jove might fetter him by the bonds of the stars. Other classical authors tended to rely more on Varro for their folk etymology, looking to the word sero, serere sevi satus, that is to sow, placing Saturn's agricultural origins at the root of his namesake. Neither of these etymologies, however, are ultimately correct, but they betray the early presence of a matrix of ideas that surrounded these various divinities: the Greek embodiment of time, the Latin god of the Golden Age, who was also the Etruscan god of the underworld, and even at one point syncretized with the Carthaginian Baal Hamon. All of these eventually played some small role in the syncretic personas which astrologers and star worshippers mapped onto that dim and distant star. It's around the Latin Saturnus that the Saturnalia had emerged, that great festival of licentious joy concerned with the temporary inversion of social order, and I emphasize temporary, when the world of the dead spilled out among the living and chaos overturned order, only for those boundaries to be triumphantly reestablished once again shortly thereafter. For these reasons, the classical form of the god Saturnus had a long symbolic association with spending time in otium, that is leisure, while in his more negative medieval portrayal as a planet, he became a sign of those trapped in negotium, plowing, digging, banking, imprisonment, etc. Saturn's relation to slavery and slaves existed among the Latins on account of his jurisdiction given to him by the Etruscans as a lord of the underworld. This jurisdiction included dominion over both the dead and the quasi-living. That is, the Romans did not consider slaves as wholly among the living, and thus attributed them to Saturnus's dominion. This Saturnus was also the husband of Ops, that is wealth, the guardian of the treasury, the inventor of weights and measures, and of money itself, and as such, he was already perceived very ambiguously in antiquity. This ambiguity fed into the planet's image in the Middle Ages, but it faded toward the more negative side, not to reemerge in the Latin West until the humanists discovered it as a byproduct of their astrological studies, which were shaped more by their love of the classics and their disdain for both determinism and astromagic's more demonic facets. From Roman antiquity, then, through a process of what we might call the astrologization of the planets, Saturn's dark light became interconnected with time, toil, wealth, or the absence thereof, the longue durée, and by extension, through the correlative imagination of the pre-modern mind, elderliness, decrepitude, melancholy, disease, foul odors, and misfortune. For this, among other reasons, he became lord of the removed, the contemplative, the sedentary, and in keeping with this strain of thought, of scholars. Perhaps based on observations of patterns in nature, the passing of time became associated with the humoral qualities of coldness and dryness, and these became inextricably associated with Saturn from a very early period. Animal and vegetable things left exposed to the elements simply tended to change from hot and moist states to cold and dry states through the mere passage of time. Saturn, however, wasn't only an emblem of time's passage, but also an emblem of timelessness. As the planet closest to the edge of the known universe, Saturn straddled the boundary between the worlds of immutability and change, wholeness and corruption. His peculiar relation to both prophecy and Judaism, for example, can in part be explained on account of his perceptions regarding their mutually shared nearness to a state of timelessness. Following the Platonic dichotomy between divine and human knowledge, it was understood that true prophecy was a kind of madness that came from the level of intellection which transcended the ostensibly cyclical motion of normal time. Human knowledge was largely concerned with the changing and the mutable, while divine truths like geometry or scripture dwelt outside of time, in the mind of God himself, where past, present, and future folded into one eternity. This point is important because it emphasizes an aspect of Saturn's dual nature as both a transcendent and an immanent figure, and consequently a good and a less good figure from the perspective of an Augustinian framework. It's that same dual nature which would allow someone like Ficino to perceive Saturn both in a light and a dark side, one aspect to be retained and one to be rejected, in putting together his system for drawing down only the goods which that planet might offer without exacerbating the ills. Despite Saturn's various and fundamentally ancient roots, we mustn't allow too much of the mythology from ancient pagan antiquity to color our views of either 10th or 15th century astral magic, just in the same way we mustn't allow too much of our understanding of today's astronomy to anachronistically color our views. Though some influences remained, much of the knowledge of what these influences linked back to had been forgotten. By the Middle Ages, the planets had long lost their status as gods and had been demoted into celestial objects made of fifth essence, whirling about within a more stoic conception of nature, set in place by God for the execution of his will. In the words of Dieter Bloom, the bridge leading back to the gods of antiquity was thus definitely burned. Even educated readers would not have made the connection anymore, so in the field of planetary astrology, there was in fact no survival of the pagan gods. End quote. Although much of the character of the Greek Kronos or the Roman Saturnus had persisted in abstraction in the astrological characters and imagery of Saturn, Today's widely recognized image of a winged, child-eating Father Time from Greek mythology didn't appear until the early 15th century. It was Boccaccio's genealogy of the gods that played a significant role in reconnecting the mythical and astrological personas of Saturn in Europe during the Renaissance. Until the humanists had re-envisioned him in the light of his more ancient ambivalence, Saturn's image in Europe was essentially that of a poor, crippled farmer, or a Jew, leaning on a crutch, an image drawn up from translations of Abu Mashar. By at least the 1st century BC, though probably since an even earlier time thanks to a Chaldean influence, the planets had been systematically divided into fortunate and unfortunate planets, with Venus and Jupiter being auspicious, Mercury being neutral, and Mars and Saturn being inauspicious. By the time Ptolemy composed his Tetrabiblos in the 2nd century AD, most astrologers had defined their science in line with naturalistic principles. Either it was a quest to understand causal influences from the pneumatic, ethereal world down into the world of matter, or alternatively, a quest to read the heavens as omens, portents, and signs. To most Stoics, astrology was a divinatory practice of reading signs, which allowed a given sage to foresee his future and to make peace with it, not to alter its course by affecting chains of causality, as was later attempted by those who attempted the science of talismans in a Chaldean mode. Here, the planets acted like nodes within networks of similitudes, radiating particular influences down to Earth through the ether, connecting all things under their dominion. This now mathematizable cosmos was taken up by natural philosophers, some of whom held more emphatically to the Stoic principles of fate and determinism than others. This outlook left little room for flexibility in negotiating with the gods. Although the pagan cults faded out gradually under the pressures of Christian or Islamic persecution, the gods' names and some of the ideas associated with them endured, especially so in the lands of the Eastern Roman Empire, where religious institutions were less successful or less determined in snuffing out competition. As first-hand memory of the pagan gods gradually faded over centuries, the planets consequently began to be perceived as natural rather than supernatural powers, and thus those mysterious luminaries became the subject of widespread speculation by natural philosophers. On into the Arabic tradition, we find that it was the Andalusian alchemist and astral magician Maslama al-Qurtubi, who first brought the occult sciences as exemplified by Muslim thinkers like al-Kindi, Abu Mashar, and later the Brethren of Purity, the Ikhwan al-Safa, to Muslim Spain. Here, the combined efforts of various Islamic, Christian, and Jewish scholars were employed in a multi-generational process to reconcile the various systems whose texts had been inherited: the Aristotelian and the Pseudo-Aristotelian, the Stoic, the Platonic, and the Hermetic. In this seemingly paradoxical blend of many divergent philosophical schools, the world they imagined wasn't one of strict determinism. It left wiggle room for the agency of the will. Rather than a cosmos populated by autonomous divinities, these men employed Plato's idea of celestial souls for the planets, and these were further attributed with retinues of ray-transmitting spiritual entities, or later ruhaniyat, each of whom were also endowed with their own wills, which could be invoked and placated in the name of God. These beings were thought of as agents of creation, that is, channels for God's creative energies, but they were far from being eternal and uncreated creators themselves. The rays they transmitted did indeed shape material reality, but they did so volitionally, not mechanistically, and could therefore be persuaded by certain techniques to alter the dynamics of generation and corruption in the terrestrial world. It's for this reason that by the High Middle Ages, to quote Bloom again, when it was decided to depict these astrological powers in the Latin West, the appropriate images first had to be invented, and it wasn't Ovid, but Abu Mashar who was consulted. End quote. Here, the formerly independent gods of various pagan pantheons were now interpreted as ethereal and supra-lunary agents of generation and corruption, set in motion by the prime mover, whose effects could be understood only through the astronomical calculation of the rays that their retinue of spirits transmitted. This, then, is how the reader of the Picatrix was meant to conceptualize the planets. Not as ancient gods or as massive material objects in the sky, but as luminous, ensouled forces of nature, surrounded by spirits with wills of their own, which were then draped in syncretic imagery drawn up from the teachings of the ancient sages, in whom were maintained some traces of their former godlike characteristics, or conversely, in whom new foreign accretions from distant lands were passed along. During the Renaissance, all of these tensions and conflicting viewpoints over the nature of the planets came to a head. In an attempt to free himself from the potential of public disgrace that might arise through any trace of involvement with idolatry or demonology, our priest-physician Marsilio Ficino ultimately came to hold the heavenly bodies more emphatically as spiritual signs, that is, objects that impress themselves upon the human spirit, than as direct physical causes, that is, which impress themselves on matter via heat or supernaturally through demonic agency. Nevertheless, he would never wholly get away from the model provided by his more immediate influences, in whom the boundaries between the causal and the semiotic facets of astrology were blurred together. In his unpublished Disputatio contra Judicium Astrologicum, composed in 1477, a few years after finishing his Theologia Platonica, Ficino unambiguously stated in a rebuke of traditional astrological doctrine that the mathematizable portion of astrology, the planetary aspects, are nothing but a fiction. The words he uses are non sunt tantum quinque aspectus nisi ex hominum factione, maintaining that the significance of each planet exists through poetic metaphor, not through reason or science. Poetica metaphora est, non ratio vel scientia. This tension arose in Ficino chiefly on account of the conflicting influences that he read both in Plotinus, the Platonist for whom the stars were emphatically signs alone and not causes, and in the works of the Arabic astrologers, for whom the stars were both. To Plotinus, wise astrologers used the signs in the heavens to understand providence, not to delude themselves into believing that they are prisoners in a web of irresistible causal action. Try as he might, however, Ficino couldn't fully escape the belief of celestial causation, especially in dealing with and in extracting valuable medical matters from the Arabic books of the astral magicians. Medicine, after all, is a search for understanding causes and their effects within the body, while astrology was doing much the same, but outside of it. This medical side of Ficino's work was particularly an interest among the Arabs which he read, but it was not one of the Platonists who scorned materialistic ends, such as the bodily health at which Ficino aimed. Part 2. Saturn and the Picatrix. So what is the Picatrix itself, hidden under the vague label of Astrologi Arabes by Ficino, despite being so central to his development, have to say about Saturn? In order to understand this, we can turn to one of our best sources, as laid out in Book 3, Chapter 1, on the roles of the planets in plants, animals, and metals. Prior to the rise of Picatrix in the Latin West, Saturn's malefic nature was exacerbated by the widespread image presented of that planet in Abu Mashar, who wrote, quote, "With regard to Saturn, his nature is cold, dry, bitter, dark, violent, black, and harsh. Sometimes, too, it is cold, moist, heavy, and of stinking wind. He eats much and is honest in friendship. He presides over works of moisture, that is, waterworks and ditches, husbandry and farming, over owners of land, works of construction on estates, lakes and rivers, over measuring things, the division of estates, land, and of much property, and estates with their wealth, over avarice and bitter poverty, over domiciles, sea travel, and long sojourns abroad, over far, evil journeys, over blindness, corruption, hatred, guile, craftiness, fraud, disloyalty, harm, over being withdrawn into oneself, over loneliness and unsociability, over ostentation, lust for power, pride, haughtiness, and boastfulness, over those who enslave men and rule, as well as over every deed of wickedness, force, tyranny, and rage, over fighters, over bondage, imprisonment, distraint, fettering, honest speech, caution, reflection, understanding, testing, pondering, over much thinking, over aversion from speech and importunity, over persistence in a course. He is scarcely ever angry, but when he becomes angry, he is not master of himself. He wishes no one well. He further presides over old men and surly people, over fear, reverses of fortune, cares, fits of sadness, writing, confusion, affliction, hard life, straits, loss, deaths, inheritances, dirges and orphanages, over old things, grandfathers, fathers, elder brothers, servants, grooms, misers, and people whose attention women require, over those covered with shame, thieves, gravediggers, corpse robbers, tanners, and over those people who count things, over magic and rebels, over low-born people and eunuchs, over long reflection and little speech, over secrets, while no one knows what's in him, and neither does he show it, though he knows every dark occasion. He presides over self-destruction and matters of boredom." End quote. And that was Abu Mashar. The correspondences presented in this passage, as we'll see, were as deeply influential to al-Qurtubi as to the intellectuals of the Latin world in later centuries. Nevertheless, al-Qurtubi's image of Saturn was also tempered by different sources which maintained a more ancient, pagan element of Saturn's ambiguity. By and large, these were sources concerned with planetary prayers, more colored by Near Eastern, Chaldean, and Indian influences than Hellenistic ones. These were works like Ibn Washia's Chaldean or Nabatean agriculture, or the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica, such as the Kitab al-Istimakis, whose authors unfailingly persisted in looking to Saturn as a source of both good and ill. In the following passages written by al-Qurtubi, we can see the distinctive influence of the correspondences present in Abu Mashar, but so too that of the more Hermetic authors. Quote, Saturn is the source of retentive power. He governs an aspect toward profound knowledge, the science of law, the search for causes, effects, the origins of things, the utterance of magical words, and the knowledge of deep and occult properties. From the languages, he governs Hebrew and Chaldean. From the external appendages, he governs the right ear. From the internal organs, he governs the spleen, which is the source of all melancholy conjoining all organs. From the religions, he governs Judaism. From cloth types, he governs all black cloth. From the crafts, he rules working the soil, plowing, digging, extracting, and working minerals, and the building trades. From the tastes, he governs the bitter. Among locations, he governs black mountains, murky rivers, deep wells, ditches, and desert places. From the stones, he governs onyx and all black stones. From metals, he governs lead, iron, and all black musty metals. From the trees, he governs elderberries, oaks, carobs, palms, and vines. From the herbs, he governs cumin, rue, onions, and all the plants that have deep leaves. From the kinds of aloe, myrrh, and similar things, he governs white lead and colocynth. From the incenses, he strongly governs cinnamon and storax gum. From the animals, he governs black camels, pigs, monkeys, bears, dogs, and cats. From the birds, he governs all those with a long neck and a powerful cry, like cranes, ostriches, duga, and crows. He governs all the animals that live beneath the earth, all the tiny, juicy, and foul-smelling creatures, that is, insects. From the colors, he governs every black and tawny color. End quote. And that was Picatrix 313. The text goes on to state that the color of Saturn is like burnt wool, and that his talismanic image, the figure through which one draws upon Saturn's spiritual power, is the shape of a black man wrapped in a green cloak with a dog-like head and a sickle in his hand. When Saturn is in a favorable astrological position, that is, when he sits in Libra, his exaltation, in Aquarius, the house of his planetary joy, or in Capricorn, his second house, and when you wish to pray to him, Picatrix 3:7-16 says, "Dress yourself in all black clothes with a black cape tailored in the manner of a professor. Wear black shoes. Go to a place assigned to such a task, remote from mankind and humbly chosen. Walk there with a humble will in the fashion of a Jew, for Saturn was the lord of their Sabbath. Hold an iron ring in your hand and carry an iron censer. In it place burning charcoal upon which you should set the suffumigating mixture whose recipe is this. Take equal parts of opium, aktarag, which is an herb, saffron, laurel seed, carob, wormwood, lanolin, colocynth, and the head of a black cat. Grind them up and mix everything together with the urine of a black she-goat in equal parts, then make some tablets out of it. When you wish to operate, place one of these on the burning coals of the censer. Then, turn your face towards Saturn while the smoke rises from the censer, and say this prayer. O Lord on high, whose name is great and stands firm in the heavens above all the heavens' planets, he whom God placed sublime and lofty, you are Lord Saturn, cold and dry, dark, author of good, honest in your friendship, true in your promises, enduring and persevering in your amity and hatred. Your perception is far and deep, honest in your words and promises. Alone, lonely, removed from others in your works, with sadness and pain, removed from rejoicing and festivities. You are old, ancient, wise, the despoiler of good intellect. You are a doer of good and of evil. Wretched and sad is he who is cursed by your misfortunes, but the man who attains your fortunes is blessed indeed. In you God placed power and strength and a spirit doing both good and evil. I ask you, Father and Lord, by your lofty names and wondrous acts, that you should do such and such a thing for me. We are then instructed to speak our request, prostrate ourselves upon the ground towards Saturn with humility, sadness, gentleness, and a purified will. If we do this many times on Saturday, in the hour of Saturn, then know that our request will be fulfilled with effect. From passages such as these, it should be clear that, thanks to a revival of Sabian influence in Al-Qurtubi, Saturn is again emphasized for his ambivalent rather than wholly negative nature. Here he is praised as a doer of good and of evil, and his dual nature is strongly emphasized in a number of ways. Up in his lofty seat, he's a liminal figure, a sign of eternity's descent into normal time, or vice versa, a sign of the last rung in one's ascent from normal time into eternity. He is both an evil sorcerer and a holy prophet. With his honesty, great hope and great fear are mixed in together. For as much misfortune as Saturn is shown to be responsible for in Abu Mashar, in due proportion, Picatrix highlights the hidden treasures he hides behind his somber disposition, and it was this twofold nature of Saturn which would become so prominent in Ficino. In addition to these passages so essential to elucidating Saturn's nature, the Picatrix contains a number of other operations dedicated to or pertaining to that planet, which, according to Al-Qurtubi, were drawn from the Sabian teachings of a mysterious figure named Al-Tabari. Here Al-Qurtubi, our man of many charms and talismans, warns practitioners of sihr to keep in mind one of the most important fundamentals of astral magic: that one must never seek anything from a planet unless it is attributed to its dominion. As such, from among the petitions which here fall under Saturn's jurisdiction, we are told to seek Saturn in petitions concerning the elderly, generous men, elders, kings of cities, hermits, those who work the lands, returns to cities, inheritances, exceptional men, farmers, builders of buildings, slaves, thieves, fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers. If you are caught up in deep thought and grief, in melancholy or grievous illness, in all these things or affairs, seek petitions from Saturn and request things assigned to his nature. Here Saturn not only signified, but could also help to cure many of the negative things traditionally assigned to his nature. One simply had to invoke and petition him in a ritual. This is the kind of information Ficino not only took to heart, but also passed along in his De Vita, and without explicit citation, to the most powerful man in Italy, his patron, Lorenzo de' Medici. He did so, however, with some modifications, namely, by not retaining a single trace of the more questionable pagan material which accompanied such lists of correspondences. Section 3717 in Picatrix goes on to state that there are other sages who used to pray to Saturn with different prayers and suffumigations, but here we're getting into the kinds of material which made Ficino nervous. In one prayer, Saturn is invoked by all his names. In Arabic, Zuhal. In Latin, Saturnus. In Phoenician, Kavin. In Roman, Korones. In Greek, Hakoronos. In Indian, Sakas. We are then instructed to sacrifice a black goat by cutting off its head and gathering its blood for keepsake, but not before removing its liver and burning it, thus fully scattering the animal's constituent rays back into the universal matrix and fulfilling the ritual conditions required to bring down the spirits. Yet another sacrifice, in 3738, entails the taking of an unblemished cow, reared on grass handpicked by young maidens every morning, then crowning its horns with golden chains and cutting off its head with a sword, while suffumigating it with the mixture attributed to Saturn, and speaking in the manner of the Greeks. Ultimately, this particular set of instructions, which should strike us as a description of a generic Greco-Roman styled pagan religious sacrifice, seems to be more a description of an operation that ancient sages did in the past, rather than something Al-Qurtubi necessarily exhorted his readers to do under the jurisdiction of Islamic law, which had enacted rules against sihr, if, that is, we are to take him at his own word. The text goes on to say that a priest would then cut out the cow's tongue, ears, snout, and eyes, while the rest of those present took their share of the meat. Afterward, they'd stare into the blood which had been collected in the saucer, and examine the froth rising up from the blood. From that froth, it is said, they understood the dominion and motion of Saturn, which according to them is the first motion, because in him motion begins and ends. This kind of sacrifice they used to make only when Saturn entered the sign of Taurus. In another set of operations contained in the Picatrix, this time drawn up from Ibn Washia's Nabatean or Chaldean agriculture, there are instructions for making a suffumigation of old hides, fat, sweat, dead bats, and mice, 14 bats and 14 mice to be exact. We are told the Chaldeans would take the ashes from this sacrifice and sprinkle them over the head of the ritual image they had crafted in the appropriate astrological hours. Then, they, quote, threw themselves down around the image on a black stone floor. End quote. From these efforts, they warded off Saturn's malefic or unfortunate effects, since every evil, every cursed thing, and every tear shed upon the earth were believed to proceed from him. The text says, "He is Lord of all poverty, misery, pain, imprisonment, turpitude, and lamentation. He signifies these things while descending and unfortunate. When he is in a good disposition and in his exaltation, however, he signifies purity, lifespan, social standing, rejoicing, honor, riches, inheritance, and the durability of inheritance in sons and grandsons." So here we can see again that Saturn wasn't all harm and damage among the Chaldeans as he might have been considered otherwise by a typical Hellenistic astrologer informed by tables of essential dignities and debilities. Rather, whether he acted as a malefic or a benefic planet was here entirely dependent upon a whole slew of astrological and ritual factors. Later in the Picatrix, we are told in a list of aphorisms allegedly drawn from the Secretum Secretorum that the best thing for which to entreat Saturn are delaying movement, concealing purity, the destruction of cities, humbling hearts, and calming waters. All of which, except perhaps the destruction of cities, could be considered morally neutral acts. I'm highlighting Saturn's ambivalence here in the Picatrix and in some of its constituent astromagical sources, because I wish to make the case that it is thanks to the influence of such passages as these that Ficino was prompted to conceptualize his relationship with that dark star ruling so prominently in his birth chart, in less fatalistic terms. He avoided recommending the invocatory and sacrificial practices just cited, demonic as they would appear to a Christian audience, but he was aware of them, and, most importantly, he was still informed by the correspondences which these ancient sages therein presented. In relating all these ostensibly pagan magical operations and planetary prayers, the author of the Picatrix had explicitly mentioned the caveat that we have included this prayer here solely for demonstrating the common agreement between the ancient sages concerning the planetary operations and the constant protection of their bodies by means of planetary natures. We include that prayer in this book such that nothing intelligible in this work of ancient sages be lacking. Now, since this prayer is forbidden in our law, we include it here merely for uncovering the sages' secrets, since they performed this ritual in ancient times before the law was given. For this reason, no one must reveal these things, since despite everything I've said about this and other rituals, I am and shall always be a teacher with good intentions. End quote. And that's from Picatrix 384. Here, in stressing his good intentions, Al-Qurtubi hints to us that he was flirting with the boundaries of legitimacy in relating this sort of information, but that it seemed at least valuable enough for him to assume the risk of relating it. Some 5 centuries later, Ficino's apology that accompanied his De Vita, dated September 19th, 1489, was written for a Christian audience, and its arguments would hardly differ. Priestcraft, medicine, magic, and astrology were all seen as inseparable disciplines among the sages of old, and as such one could not with any degree of authority deal with one of these elements in isolation from the others. It wasn't his fault the ancient sages, living without the knowledge of the gospel, had gotten so many of the truths of natural philosophy mixed up with idolatry, but he knew he'd have to work hard to extract what he thought valuable. Part 3. Saturn in Transit. The Case of Ficino. Starting in the late 12th century, the Latin West began to see new developments in theories of theology, astral magic, that is, nigromancia, and natural philosophy, which gradually coalesced into the idea that, although individuals were certainly influenced by celestial bodies, with the help of specific kinds of practical magic passed down by such beloved ancient sages as Aristotle, they could manipulate the boundaries of their respective destinies. Naturally, one of the foremost arenas for the expression of this idea was in the field of human health. Not long after the 12th century introduction of Arabic image magic into the Latin West, Christian theologians were quick to react against it with the argument that simple prayers and good works could act just as well, if not better, as effective substitutes for such potentially dangerous magical operations as those offered up in a text like the wildly popular pseudo-Aristotelian Secretum Secretorum, the Sir al-Asrar. The Franciscan Roger Bacon, for example, who'd publish his own edition of that partly astromagical text, in no way denied that the arrangement of the heavenly bodies conditioned the world below. Nevertheless, he believed that through the power of simple pieties, quote, even a poor little old woman by her prayers and merits, if supported by the benevolence of God, can change the order of nature. End quote. Prayers were addressed straight to the Creator in his supercelestial domain, and thus thought to bypass any of the intermediary mechanisms of fate, rendering all prayers and offerings to intercessory beings in the celestial world frivolous, or at worst, blasphemous. These sensibilities could be said to have begun in late antiquity with the Church Fathers' disparaging writings about the Hermetic Asclepius, and merely to have come to a head in the university debates of the 13th century, subsequently setting the haunting tone for all later debates about the nature of planetary influences in Europe's places of power. Once the scholastics had effectively stripped the science of nigromancia from all its ostensibly demonic characteristics, what was left behind was essentially magia naturalis, natural magic, an innocuous and inoffensive pursuit, that is, experimentation with the healing properties of plants or stones, or research into the iron-attracting powers of the lodestone, the study of which has often been touted as one of the chief tributaries feeding into the scientific revolution. Apart from his role as translator and court philosopher, Ficino became a major figure in his narrative as a practitioner of both magic and medicine. There's no doubt that Ficino read the Secretum Secretorum, Al-Kindi, Al-Qurtubi, and Abu Mashar in Latin translations. While his use of Al-Kindi and Abu Mashar is self-evident from his De Vita, especially since he uses formulations like Abu Mashar and some others say when citing his authorities, his selective use of Picatrix is confirmed by a letter that he dictated to Michele Acciari to be sent to Filippo Valori. In it, he discussed his cautious borrowings of Picatrix material in the composition of his De Vita. In response to Valori's request to borrow his copy of the book, Ficino explained that there's no use in reading it since everything of value in it had been transferred to his De Vita Coelitus Comparanda, the third installment of the self-help series he was writing in 1489 for his melancholic patron, Lorenzo de' Medici. If you read it diligently, says the letter, you will be left wanting nothing from that Picatrix. As one among a handful of definitive examples demonstrating his use, we can also see Ficino drew from Picatrix 2, 10, 14, and 41 his instructions on how to craft a sapphire or Feirizek ring for life extension using an image of Saturn in his hour while he's ascending and fortunately placed. Ficino justified his own use of these kinds of magical objects with the kinds of arguments one could find being made as early as the Speculum Astronomiae, a work he himself attributed, albeit incorrectly, to Albertus Magnus in response to the 1277 condemnations of Averroan and Aristotelian philosophy at the University of Paris and the rising anxieties over texts like the Secretum Secretorum. So long as he avoided the addressative magic which involves conjuring spirits, he felt he was merely manipulating impersonal forces of nature by using tools like astrological talismans and lifestyle changes, not making compacts with demons. In light of these recommendations, he put the following disclaimer in the introduction to the third book. The whole of my book forms an epitome of medicine which will assist your life as much as possible that it may be both healthy and long. And it employs at every point the resources of doctors aided by the heavens. This shop of ours displays various antidotes, drugs, fomentations, ointments, and remedies according to the differing mental capacities and natures of men. If in some way they happen to displease you, pass over these by all means, but do not for that reason repudiate the rest. Finally, if you do not approve of the astronomical images, albeit invented for the health of mortals, which even I do not so much approve of as I report, dismiss them with my complete permission, and even, if you will, by my advice. To deal more clearly with this complication in the face of scrutiny after the publication of his De Vita, Ficino wrote an apology which broke down magic into two categories, the demonic, which he called inquisitive, and the natural, which he called necessary. The latter he claimed to practice exclusively, purely as a means to achieving optimal health, while the former he claimed to reject wholeheartedly, in spite of the numerous operations he conveyed in De Vita unambiguously enacted for manipulating spirits. Throughout the De Vita, however, Ficino exhibited the nervous tendency to hide behind his authorities, the, quote, Arabs and the, quote, Platonists, whenever recommending suspect procedures, particularly talismanic operations, and therefore, he only recommended to his readers the operations he deemed salubrious and in line with established Christian principles and the conceptual guidelines of magia naturalis, as set down in the scholastic polemics from the Middle Ages. Although our melancholic priest began his De Vita Coelitus Comparanda as a commentary on Plotinus, specifically Aeneid's 4:3-11, this pretense was quickly dropped as the work expanded far beyond this initial scope, and admittedly Plotinus himself had never been interested in practical magic, talismans, or writing medical advice for princes. As such, if he was really drawing upon Chaldeans, Egyptians, and Platonists to give theoretical support to his image of a perfect sage, he did so from Iamblichus's De Mysteriis Aegyptiorum, Synesius's De Somniis, Proclus's De Sacrificio et Magia, and Michael Psellos's De Daemonibus. Despite all of these sources, and although hesitant to admit it, it wasn't chiefly from these figures, but from the Astrologi Arabes, especially the Secretum Secretorum, Al-Kindi, Abu Mashar, and Al-Qurtubi, or Picatrix, that Ficino drew the specifics for his ideas on how to achieve his perfect nature. Perfect nature is an important concept that sits at the heart of Picatrix, and it constitutes a kind of spiritual illumination experienced by the perfected sage at the summit of all learning in both the sciences and in philosophy. It was thought to comprise the fulfillment of one's inborn telos or purpose, and this could be accomplished solely by living in accordance with one's personal astrological allotment, as defined by the conditions in one's natal chart. In Picatrix, perfect nature manifests itself as a kind of knowledge and conversation with one's higher genius, which could be invoked through the fulfillment of certain ritual conditions, and this is described in Picatrix 3:6. Without explicitly naming this teleological concept in his own work, Ficino appropriated the idea of the self which strove to rise above the ebbs and flows of cosmic forces through the marriage of scientific and philosophical pursuits. What Ficino did differently, however, was to reinterpret his quest for the fulfillment of human entelechy, that is, the realization of one's potential, as a medico-physiological process rather than one which was necessarily brought about by the invocation of spirits. The Picatrix itself belongs to a pseudo-Aristotelian causal and semiotic tradition in the vein of such ray-oriented astrological systems as Al-Kindi and his student Abu Mashar, and later the Brethren of Purity, the Ikhwan al-Safa, all of whom were steeped in such literature as the talismanic pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica, and all of whose views on practical magic were also framed by the translations into Arabic of such works as the Theology of Aristotle, a paraphrased version of Porphyry's rendition of Plotinus's Aeneids 4-6, and the Book of the Pure Good, a paraphrase of Proclus's Elements of Theology, also known later as the Liber de Causis in Europe. The Picatrix might be said to be Neoplatonic insofar as its astrology and talismans were thought to operate within a Neoplatonic cosmological system consisting of hypostatic divisions emanating outward from the One. But this is merely one of its many constituent influences, and to call it purely Neoplatonic would be to efface the diversity of its sources: Hermetic, Peripatetic, Galenic, Jabirian, Pseudo-Empedoclean, etc. If we are to understand Ficino's wariness in dealing with a book like Picatrix, we must keep in mind how ideas about Saturn and the operations pertaining to him, alongside those dealing with any other planets, were transplanted from a Hellenistic and Hermetic context into a late medieval Christian one with strong eschatological, anti-Islamic, and anti-demonic sensibilities. These rituals, operations, and ingredients in Ficino's sources were professed to acquire their power from existing within a natural philosophical system that implied the hidden actions of spiritual, volitionally charged beings with whom it was long forbidden to associate. Nonetheless, in order to remain free from the strains of demonology, Ficino reconceptualized and passed on much of the Picatrix's magic as effectively naturalistic and medicinal, meaning all of the associated idolatrous baggage was unnecessary and could be left out. It is by this reconceptualization that we can see Ficino, according to the teachings of pseudo-Aristotle's Problemata, call his own Saturnine nature a unique and divine gift, in a letter to his friend Giovanni Cavalcanti. As a philosopher, priest, and melancholic individual, Ficino understood himself to be a veritable child of Saturn, But this to him wasn't necessarily a negative lot as it would have seemed to many other astrologers of his day. He would use the metaphor of hidden gold in referring to the gift that this astral configuration signified to those who were specifically on a philosophical path, that is, the path leading to the goal of the sage, the fulfillment of their natures through a complete knowledge and understanding of creation's inner workings. Ficino's sun sign was in Scorpio, ruled by Mars, but more importantly for the astrology of the period, his ascendant, that is, what lay on the eastern horizon at the time of his birth, was comprised of Saturn in Aquarius, which is the house of Saturn's joy. Perhaps the most detailed passage Ficino wrote about Saturn is the following. You certainly should not neglect the power of Saturn, for the Arabic writers, that is, Picatrix, say he is the most powerful of all. That we know planets submit their powers to those planets whom they are approaching, but that all approach him, rather than vice versa, because he is the slowest, and that planets in conjunction with him act according to his nature. For he is of all planets the head of the widest sphere. Saturn is also neighbor of the innumerable fixed stars, and indeed he is very similar to the primum mobile because he travels a lengthy circuit. He is the highest of the planets, hence they call that man fortunate whom Saturn fortunately favors. And although most people are terrified of him as alien from the ordinary life of man, nevertheless the Arabs consider he is agreeable even to the common life whenever he has very great power and dignity as he ascends, or his Jupiter, his temperer, aspects him favorably, or receives him well in his terms. Otherwise, unseasonably received in matter, particularly gross matter, his influence is like a poison, just as by putrefaction or adustion an egg may become poisonous. From such influence, certain people are born or become impure, lazy, sad, envious, and exposed to impure demons. Flee far from the company of these, for in other places the poison of Saturn lies hidden and dormant like sulfur far from flame. But in living bodies it often blazes up, and like kindled sulfur, not only burns, but fills everything around with noxious vapor and infects the bystanders. Against this influence of his, generally alien to and in a way unsuitable for human beings, Jupiter arms us by means of the following. With his natural quality, with certain foods and medicines of his, with images, as they think, and with behavior, business dealings, studies, and affairs properly pertaining to himself. But it is not only those who flee to Jupiter who escape the noxious influence of Saturn and undergo his propitious influence. It is also those who give themselves over with their whole mind to divine contemplation, signified by Saturn himself. Here among the host of sources Ficino employed, we see him trusting in Picatrix, hidden behind the simple label of Arabes, in renegotiating the consequences of being born beneath the malefic influence of Saturn, especially as it pertained to being endowed by nature with a cold and dry, melancholic complexion. Saturn, being the loftiest, most spiritually rarefied of the planets, occupied a liminal position between the celestial and the supercelestial, between the intelligible and the unintelligible, between what can be understood through the senses and what is only accessible through divine contemplation. Ficino put his faith in the notion held by the Arabic writers that on the very account of Saturn's loftiness, they call that man fortunate whom Saturn fortunately favors. In the same breath, he claims that on the one hand, a Saturnine influence at one's birth is like living with a potential poison within one's body. But on the other, he rests assured that since the Arabs consider Saturn agreeable as he ascends, or if he is well-tempered by Jupiter. Here, then, we can see from where our Florentine physician established the foundation of his ideas on how to combat melancholy. In this way, although Saturn ascending in Aquarius still signified ill health when Ficino looked at his birth chart, the positive side was that decrepitude or crippling depression would also force him into desk-bound contemplation, forcing him to rise up and out of his body toward the immutable realm of perfect ideas in the study of philosophy. A life devoted to the study of divine truths was most natural for a person of a Saturnine disposition, and to act in accordance with one's nature was simply the optimal way to live. Ficino tells us in concluding chapter 22 of his De Vita Coelitus Comparanda, entitled 7 Ways in which we can accommodate ourselves to celestial things, which is his section devoted to the various types of people for whom Saturn is either malign or propitious, whom Jupiter defends from Saturn, and, most importantly, how the heavens act on the spirit, the body, and the soul. There Ficino writes, "Just as the sun is hostile to nocturnal animals, Saturn is hostile to those people who are either leading publicly an ordinary life, or even to those fleeing the company of the crowd, but not laying aside their ordinary emotions." To Ficino, perfecting one's nature, as it is in the Picatrix or in the Secretum Secretorum, was to be achieved by working along with the conditions of one's astrological allotment, rather than giving into despair on account of one's ill-fated natal chart marred by malefic aspects. The mechanism by which this perfection could be accomplished was through balancing one's humoral complexion. One of the ways of achieving this balance was naturally by modifying one's diet, lifestyle, and exercise regimen, and the other was astromagically, with talismanic images, sacrificial invocations, or through similar means of drawing upon the planetary powers one can find in the Picatrix. Though there are numerous operations relating to the powers of Saturn therein which might be thought of as purely medicinal, there are also many of them which fall under the category of addressative or inquisitive magic, and it is these operations which were for the most part responsible for the Picatrix's nefarious reputation. These were expressly avoided by Ficino, but the descriptions of Saturn's character and the things of this world which he governed, those remained useful in matters pertaining to medicine and altering one's complexion and physiology. Fully conscious of Saturn's dangerous, albeit ambivalent character, Ficino made it clear in De Vita that Saturn cannot easily signify the common quality and lot of the human race, which is solar, but he signifies an individual set apart from the others, divine or brutish, blessed or bowed down with the extreme of misery. To understand this elevation of Saturn through his application of astromagical principles, we need to revisit briefly the question of semiology and causation in the context of the Neoplatonic, Peripatetic, and Hermetic sources at his disposal. Debates as to whether stars were signs or causes ranged back to the Hellenistic period and were not new. Though the concepts of signs and causes cannot necessarily be said to be mutually exclusive in the pre-modern mind, Ficino had begun his project struggling to see the things of this world more in line with his favorite ancient sage, Plotinus, which is, for example, why he held the science of planetary aspects as chiefly metaphora. Plotinus's own perspective had differed from the claims of the more stoically minded astrological determinists of his own day. That is, he saw the things of this world as signified but not caused by the conjunctions of heavenly bodies. Nevertheless, this perspective, as juxtaposed with the perspective contained in Picatrix, such as in Picatrix 131, where the rays are both vectors of spirit and of elementary heat, forced Ficino to complexify his thinking. Had Ficino been operating purely on Neoplatonic foundations in his conception of the cosmos, he would have ignored the idea of planetary rays altogether and stood with Plotinus in the belief that the stars are strictly signs and not causes. To get around this idea, which was problematic for the degree to which Ficino's system was physical and medical, he employed the idea of a spiritus, a kind of malleable semi-substance animated by the soul, so as to retain the idea that stellar influences acted upon the medium of spirit before acting on the body, thus avoiding a rigidly mechanistic system without room for the exercise of free will. The nature of this spiritus, hot and moist, he associated chiefly with Jupiter and the Sun, claiming that, quote, a healthy spirit does not have much in common with Saturn, Mars, or the Moon. Otherwise, it would be foolish as a result of the first, mad from the second, and insensitive from the last. In line with this, lunar beings, being too heavy and moist, are very foreign to the subtle and volatile nature of the spirit. Things which are very saturnine and too martial are like poisons, naturally hostile to the spirit. When, therefore, the case demands that you help some one of the three spirits, the poor client will be difficult to help at a time when its patron, the planet ruling in his or her nativity, is unfortunate or debilitated. End quote. If the celestial world caused an actor with free will to do anything, then Ficino believed that it first had to go through the medium of spiritus before affecting the body. This idea came not from Plotinus, but from passages like Picatrix 411. Ficino took therefrom the notion that the celestial souls or planets impress themselves chiefly on human souls through the transmission of their spirits by means of rays. Such rays, emanating from the universal circle of spirit, cascaded through the heavens down into the spirit of the individual human. He explained the mechanism as such, quote, whenever we say celestial goods descend to us, understand, 1, that gifts from the celestial bodies come into our bodies through our rightly prepared spirit. 2, that even before that, through their rays, the same gifts flow into a spirit exposed to them either naturally or by whatever means. And 3, that the goods of the celestial souls partly leap forth into this our spirit through rays, and from there overflow into our souls, and partly come straight from their souls, or from angels, into human souls which have been exposed to them. Exposed, I say, not so much from some natural means as by the election of free will or by affection. End quote. In this more humorally oriented and psychologically restricted approach to astral influences, Ficino could uphold both his sense of orthodoxy and his learning in astral magic. With a modified or Christian-friendly version of the causal and semiotic perspective from Picatrix, Ficino could interpret contemporary astrological theory with an emphasis on the mediating role of the spirit, man's predisposition to it, and the freedom of the will, all while maintaining the existence of celestial and supercelestial intelligences. In accordance with the teachings of Alkindis de Radiis, the Secretum Secretorum, and Picatrix, however, Ficino believed that if the human spirit was properly disposed for the consumption or avoidance of specific natural things, then it would more easily receive the influence of specific celestial souls. Since Ficino believed that he felt Saturn's influence by the election of free will, or by affection, through the medium of spirit, he gave himself good incentive to perceive Saturn as not all malefics and misfortunes in the way which he had been popularly perceived through the systems of essential dignities and debilities stretching back to Alexandrian astrology. In line with the teachings of Picatrix, Ficino chose to perceive Saturn more explicitly as the noblest star, as that which is furthest from the earth and therefore closest to God, who is immutable and transcendent. This choice he enacted by tempering Saturn's hostile nature rather than by beseeching him directly. By means of various techniques that mitigated Saturn's spiritually poisonous effects, Ficino disposed himself to Saturn's more edifying qualities. This lofty and noble Saturn, now medically placated as it were, thus became an ambivalent rather than a malefic star. If Saturn was unfortunate to a given individual, Ficino would have argued that it was because that individual refused to exercise their free will and learn how to align, condition, and prepare their spirits against his malignant effects. In the maintenance of optimal health, therefore, Ficino advised melancholics, himself included among them, to counterbalance their Saturnine natures with jovial and venereal qualities, whether through conscious exposure to the rays of Jupiter and Venus, or through the use of talismanic images, music, and medicine made from substances that impress similar effects upon the soul through the influx of the planet's spiritual rays. He did not, for example, advise his clients to reenact the rituals of Al-Tabari, but he did make use of the many lists cataloging what kind of things pertain to what planets, which could then be employed in tempering all kinds of undesirable planetary influences. In dealing with this issue, Ficino denied that the malefic planets were intrinsically harmful by necessity, holding instead to the notion that the dose makes the poison. Quote, "If anyone wishes to convict Saturn and Mars of being harmful by nature, which I never would believe, still they are to be used just as doctors sometimes use poisons." Ptolemy endorses this in his Centiloquium, which is one of the Picatrix's many sources. The force of Saturn, therefore, cautiously taken, will sometimes profit, just as doctors say those things do which are astringent and constrictive, even those things which stupefy, as opium and mandrake. The Magi, Brahmins, and Pythagoreans seem to have been most prudent in this, in that when they feared that Saturn would oppress them on account of their sedulous zeal for philosophizing, they'd wear white clothes, use jovial or Theban sounds and songs every day, and live continuously in open air. Here, drugs and medicinal plants become Ficino's chief metaphor for understanding planetary influences, and the very effects of Saturn were thought to work analogously to those stupefying plants which that planet so appropriately governed. Again, Ficino wasn't merely making up the advice he gave. Rather, his advice was variously rooted in the authority of ancient sages, men of renown and athletes of asceticism whom our humanist philosopher revered, and who were all included in that carefully collected compendium made up of over 224 sources called Picatrix. These included operations of such renowned sages as Ptolemy, Jabir ibn Hayyan, Ibn Washiyah, Plato, Aristotle, and Hermes Trismegistus, and their perceived antiquity significantly reinforced Ficino's confidence as to their veracity and effectiveness. In De Vita, Ficino set himself to the task of explaining why it is that men like Magi, Brahmins, and Pythagoreans, namely scholars, always find themselves suffering from their sedulous zeal for philosophizing. He concluded that cogitation, long wakefulness, and worry create an excessive dryness in the human body, which thereby exacerbates a cold and dry or melancholic complexion. This humoral complexion produced various effects in the human spirit, which then predisposed the body and soul to receive effects that were associated with Saturn's power. Although Ficino provided a natural pathology for the scholar's suffering and looked to treat symptoms with natural remedies, his list of things for patients to consume or avoid correspond with the list of things that correspond with planetary influences in Picatrix or Abu Mashar. Ficino's anti-melancholy therapies were made up of things traditionally signified by those planets which countered Saturn's malefic influences, like the use of gold, lyre music, walks through the garden, leisure, and the company of agreeable people, that is, jovial and venereal things. Such cures were passed on by Ficino as non-magical medicinal information, as the wisdom of ancient sages. But his sources in this regard were discreetly astromagical, based on ideas from a science of aspects which he largely disbelieved, and a system of demonic conjuration he found abhorrent, but which he felt produced positive effects regardless. These weren't the teachings of Alexandrian Neoplatonists. In writing about how to avoid that most awful kind of black bile, Ficino suggested avoiding the following Saturnine themes. Quote, heavy and thick wine, especially if it is dark. Food which is hard, dry, salted, bitter, sharp, stale, burnt, roasted, or fried. Beef and the meat of a hare, old cheese, foods pickled in brine, vegetables, especially the broad bean, the lentil, the eggplant, the colewort, cabbage, mustard, the radish, the garlic, the onion, the leek, the black medic, and carrots, and whatever causes warmth or cold, and likewise dryness, and everything that's black. Anger, fear, pity, sorrow, idleness, solitude, and whatever offends the sight, smell, and hearing, and most of all, darkness. Moreover, excessive dryness of the body increases black bile, whether it be the result of long wakefulness or much agitation of the mind or worry, or frequent sexual intercourse, and the use of things which are very hot and dry, or the result of any immoderate flux and purgation, or strenuous exercise, or fasting, or thirst, or heat, or a too dry wind, or cold. Since indeed black bile is always very dry and also cold, although not equally so, it must certainly be resisted with things which are moderately hot, but as moist as possible, and with foods that have been thoroughly boiled, since they are easily digested and produce blood which is subtle and very clear. End quote. By tempering the body through the avoidance of these things, one tempered the spirit, making it hot and moist as it ought to be, and thereby counteracting the negative effects of a Saturnine disposition, which is cold and dry. Here Ficino the physician, who plundered books of magic to find cures for his Saturnine Medici patron, further softened the image of Saturn as a pitiless source of misfortune. He showed, through the sanitized techniques he appropriated from astral magic, how that dark star's negative effects could naturally and willfully be mitigated, leaving behind only the positive ones. He didn't make sacrifices and invocations to Saturn in order to acquire these effects. Instead, he simply avoided those things which conditioned the spiritus to receive more Saturnine influence, and countered natural predispositions with anti-Saturnine activities, foods, jewelry, and other materia medica. Through this distinctly non-addressative medical or therapeutic approach to manipulating astral influences, Ficino softened the image of Saturn as a malefic spirit or stellar daimon, whose veneration the schoolmen had been decrying since the 13th century in their repudiations of the Secretum Secretorum. Ficino's idiosyncratic synthesis of contemporary medicine, Christian theology, Neoplatonic philosophy, and Hermetic astral magic further sublimated Saturn not only by re-emphasizing his ambivalent nature, but by paving a way for intellectuals to think about Saturn as signifying natural phenomena which caused harm and disease, like darkness, miasma, bogs, and insects, without causing them directly through unimpeded demonic or supernatural influence. What's important to keep in mind is that Ficino, being inspired by, but also going beyond the Arabs and Platonists that he read, saw Saturn as a figure who, unlike any other planet, was a Janus-faced lord of dualism and a governor of extremes, of great riches and great poverty, of thriving crops and ruin, of safety and of restraint. Through this inherited feature, an individual held under the sway of Saturn's dominion could create for himself a significant amount of flexibility within their own fated allotment, which could form the basis for a whole new picture of how the cosmos operates. Klebansky, Panofsky, and Saxel, therefore, were very much correct to note that in regards to Saturn, quote, the birth of this new humanist awareness took place in an atmosphere of internal contradiction. Conclusion. Throughout this talk, we've looked at a number of associations attributed to Saturn in texts spanning from Greco-Roman antiquity to Ficino. We saw how, although many of these associations had their roots in the polytheistic imagery of antiquity, the very concept of what a planet is and how it operates underwent dramatic change throughout the Middle Ages as such ideas coalesced and transformed. We saw how this ancient divinity, with all his attendant mythology, part chthonic and part celestial, was from a rather early time demoted from his lofty place as an ambivalent god to a largely malefic force of nature by the deterministically minded among the Hellenistic astrologers, who needed purely unfortunate planets to make their mathematical point-based system of aspects operational. After this, we saw how this largely malefic, unfortunate, or negative image of Saturn was gradually restored to a state of ambivalence through a synthesis of the Platonists and the Arab astrologers envisioned by Marsilio Ficino. Though Ficino styled himself more so as an Orthodox Catholic philosopher, priest, and physician when dabbling in magical matters, the authors from which he read were more steeped in the inquisitive or addressative practices of the pagan world. Most of these practices Ficino considered transgressive, and so he borrowed ideas cautiously, adopting only what he believed salubrious and in keeping with his ideas about natural philosophy and medicine. We looked at some of the prayers, suffumigations, and sacrifices pertaining to Saturn and spirits as laid out explicitly in the Picatrix. From among these we distinguished two kinds of operations, one which could be adapted to become acceptable to Christian intellectual circles, namely the therapeutic kind, and one which was considered abominable, the kind which made recourse to spirits in order to manipulate the forces of generation and corruption, and thereby enact various unfulfilled material desires. The former kind Ficino passed along with pride. The latter kind he passed over in silence, or at least drew from them what he thought valuable, namely the correspondences, and excluded the rest. Although divorced from the pagan context in which he originated, this return of an ambivalent Saturn played a lofty role in the Ficinian cosmology.